Hi, I'm Lauren, and I'm going to be presenting this paper called How Useful is Executive Control Training, Age Differences in Near and Far Transfer of Task Switching Training. So before we start, I just want you to start brainstorming. Think of a time where you've practiced a set of abilities and how this is translated in your performance to other tasks, if it was helpful or if it was irrelevant. And then overview of the paper, or like an introduction of what we're going to be talking about. So what is executive control? Executive control is our ability to plan, guide, and monitor our goal-directed actions. And it's very important in human behavior, human intelligence. What does training imply? Simply just implies practice. And then we're going to be talking about the near and far transfer of task switching training. So the near transfer would be how practice translates to performance in very similar tasks to what you've been training on. And far would be how the practice translates to very different tasks and if it has an effect. So overall, this paper is interested in looking at the age differences in the type of transfer in task switch training. So if there are differences in the two types of transfer. So what is known so far? There's evidence of age-related changes in executive control from task switching paradigms. So in this example, we can see there's task A, task B. They're very simple tasks. Task A could be you see two stimuli and ask which one's larger, which one's bigger or smaller. And then task B would be, do you see a fruit or a vegetable? Something like that. Some participants will be in the single task block, some will be mixed. So single, your one block is all of the same task over and over. Mixed would be it changes between the two. From here, we can measure mixing cost or just costs. So first we have mixing costs, which are the difference in performance between the single and mixed blocks. And then the switching costs are the difference between the individual tasks themselves. So what we know in terms of age differences is that young adults show the least amount of mixing costs, and young children and older adults show much higher mixing costs. So their performance is very different before and after training. We also know the potential range of cognitive plasticity and task switching abilities has been investigated. So we know that training and practice can reduce age-related differences in both kinds of switching costs. So key finding from this study was participants are doing the incongruent task versus the congruent task. And we can see that mixing costs, so the performance between the two is smallest in the young adults, and then it's like bigger reduced. It's more reduced in the children and older adults. So the performance is worse at the beginning and it gets a lot better versus young adults who are already kind of better and then perform a little bit better, if that makes sense. We also can see that there's some evidence of the transfer of executive control through training in young children. So in this study, they took 3 to 4-year-old children and either trained them on the dimensional card sorting task or the false belief task. And whichever one they were trained on, their performance on the other task without direct training for it did improve. So we're seeing a little bit of far transfer here. So the gap. So what we know so far is that mixed costs show an age effect. Specifically, we can see that young adults have the least amount of mixing costs. And then with training, switching and mixing costs can be reduced. So practice is increasing performance. And then younger children show that certain executive control training could be transferred to structurally similar and dissimilar tasks. So we can see evidence that children do show near and far transfer, but there's a lot less evidence specifically in older adults comparing the two. A lot of studies primarily look at children. There's more with younger adults, but very few with older. So there's a big gap in life or life trajectory differences. So this leads to the big aim of the study, which is to investigate age-related changes in the near and far transfer of training and the influence of the different types of training, all in one study and then across a wide variety of ages. So the current study, we're going to be applying the task switching paradigm, which uses at least two aspects of cognitive control. So we have the task set maintenance and selection, so choosing and then holding on to certain rules. And then task set shifting, so switching between the different tasks like we talked about with A and B. This will be extended further once we get into it. And then participants are recruited by age across the lifespan. So all three age groups are going to be covered. We're going to have children, young adults, older adults. They're going to be tested in a pre-test condition on a variety of tasks. Then they're going to go through different types of training, and then their performance is going to be tested again. And then the post-test performance is going to be compared to the pre-test performance to see which types of training modulated the most significant differences. And the two big goals of the study. One is to examine the age differences in the transfer of task switching training to similar types of tasks. So this is near transfer and its modulation by the type of training that they're in, and to investigate the range of transfer. So looking at age-related changes in far transfer task switching training to other executive control tasks, so in different tasks. So the first hypothesis that came from the study, they expected more transfer after the variable type of training. So we'll get into that more later too, but this is where in each training session, the tasks and stimuli that they're being trained on vary. So this kind of, I found that it related to the constructivist learning theory. So it's the idea that you have your set of knowledge and you keep building onto it and adding to it. And then the second type, or the second hypothesis, is they expected to see more transfer of training to structurally similar tasks rather than structurally dissimilar tasks. This makes sense. You would think what you practice on, you'd be tested on things that are similar to it, would probably be easier than trying to extend that training to much more different tasks. And then I came up with a few hypotheses of my own, more related to age, based on all the previous research that's been done. So my first hypothesis is that differences in post-test to pre-test performance would be smallest in young adults compared to children and older adults. So I think that this will align with prefrontal cortex development. So in young children, this is so very much so developing. Younger adults either do have fully developed prefrontal cortexes or are close to being at that point. And then while older adults do have fully developed prefrontal cortexes, we're starting to see brain degeneration. So performance is being affected in cognitive abilities. And then my second hypothesis is that young children will show better performance post-test after training than younger adults after the same training. So this aligns with research I've done by Janex. And they found that in a sample from 4 to 86-year-olds, that it was the 4 to 12-year-olds that showed the fastest training or the fastest performance or reaction times in the testing after the training. And younger adults showed the slowest response times in the testing condition, so that young children are learning faster. Moving on to the methods. So all of the subjects were recruited from a university in Germany, and they were all paid for completing all the sessions. And then subjects were divided, or participants were divided into 3 age groups. So we have children, young adults, and older adults, 56 in each group. So the mean age for children was 9.2. For young adults, it was 22.4. And for older adults, it was 68.7. So materials and procedures. So all of the participants were shown all of the tasks on this computer screen right here with the keyboard so they can respond. So a very old computer, we can see the 2009. And then all of the subjects, no matter their age, are going to be doing the pre-test and post-test. They're exactly the same. So we can see the single tasks and the task switching. So these are looking at near transfer just between the two, task A and task B. And then we can see in the cognitive battery, this is where far transfer is going to be assessed in these different executive functioning tasks. So after they do the pre-test, then within each age group, they're divided into 4 different training groups. And then they're going to be tested or trained within those training groups. And then they're going to be doing the post-test, which is exactly the same as pre-test, just comparing the performance after training. And this is also done over a 6 to 8 week period. So pre-test and post-test. So we're kind of looking at these 2 tasks right now. So they're task A and task B. So in the study, one of the task A's was you either have to say fruit or vegetable. Then in task B, you have to say whether the fruit or vegetable was large or small. And there's 16 different fruits and vegetables, so they're varying in that way in all different sizes. So the mixing costs in the study are the difference in mean performance between the single and mixed task blocks, similar to what I said at the beginning. And the switching costs are the difference between the non-switch and switch trials within the mixed task blocks. So we can see how the blocks work here with 2 single practice, 20 experimental, and then they have a fixation cross before each response is required. And then looking into the cognitive battery, so the 4 executive functioning tasks that are going to be tested pre and post test. So that within each 4 types, there are 2 different versions of the task just to increase reliability. So for inhibitory control, there's color and numbers group, which we can see the color here. and the number here. So in the neutral condition, the colors don't conflict with the word, or it's just completely neutral. And then in the number Stroop, they're letters. So saying 3, 4, and 2 doesn't, the letters don't interfere with that. And then incongruent, the colors don't match. And then here the numbers don't match how many characters there are. We can see the 2 practice blocks for experimental blocks again, and then the fixation cross. And the Stroop interference is the performance between the 2 conditions, between neutral and incongruent. And then the next cognitive battery task is verbal working memory. So we have reading span and counting span. So these were taken from Kane's study because the study itself didn't present a lot of details here. So I want to present it further. So with the reading span, they're read a sentence or they read a sentence that either makes sense or doesn't. And then a letter is said at the end. So their response, they either have to say if the sentence made sense and then the letter that was said at the end, and a blank screen, and then they're either presented with another sentence combination or a recall cue. So they have to say which letter was said at the end. And then the counting span works pretty similar. They have to count the number of dark circles allowed, and then say the total number again at the end, and a blank screen, and they're either given a recall cue to say how many there were, or they get another set and they might have to count the light circles, for example, and then the same thing. And then looking at the spatial working memory, we have symmetry and navigation span. So symmetry, they're presented with configurations that are either symmetrical or not along the vertical axis, then shown a red dot on the screen, another configuration, a dot, and this either keeps going or they're asked to say where the dot was after seeing a blank screen. And if the figure was symmetrical along the vertical axis or not. And then in navigation span, they're shown where the dot is being traveled around, either an E or an H. And then this either keeps happening or they're presented with a recall cue and have to like say the pattern that the ball went. And then fluid intelligence is measured in 3 different tasks. So we have figural reasoning. So for example, A is to B, C is to, and the participants have to respond. And then the letter series, so like A, C, E, G, I, the correct response would be K. And then Raven's progressive matrices. So they're shown this pattern here, and then 8 possible options for how the pattern should be completed. And then comes the training sessions. So within each age group, there's 56 individuals. And within those 56, they're evenly divided into the 4 training conditions. So the first group is low executive control. So they're practicing single tasks. So like just A, just B, just A, just B, something like that. And then group 2, they only practice the mixed block. So it's switching like A, B, B, A, B, whatever, something like that. So executive control demands are a lot higher. Group 3 is exactly the same as group 2, but they also have to verbalize the upcoming goals. So if they have to say, if it's a vegetable or a fruit, then they'll have to say vegetable or fruit before they see it. And then group 4 is exactly the same as group 3, but they add the variability aspect to it. So the tasks and stimuli that they're practicing with are different from each other. So just briefly, the data analysis, what it's going to look like. The task switching and Stroop are measured with response time. Practice blocks, like the first ones, are not counted. And then data are corrected for multiple comparisons. And then the remaining tasks, so the working memory, fluid intelligence, both of the working memories is just looking at correct responses. And then to examine the range of transfer effects across the training conditions, we're using Cohen's d to see the effect sizes. Okay, now we're moving on to the results. So first, looking at the training data, we're investigating training-related benefits. So a 4-way ANOVA was conducted using the age groups, the training, the session, and the trial type. And we can see that there was a quadratic age effect. So this is an F statistic here, and we can see the F statistic is very large, which indicates that this effect is more than would be expected by chance. We're seeing a very significant p-value, and then the effect size is also very large, which indicates that age has a large effect on the reaction time. Then there's also a main effect for session. So this means that reaction time is getting smaller and smaller from first to last training, and the results are very significant here as well, and very large. And then last, we can see a significant switching cost, which is smaller for young adults than for children and older adults. So younger adults can basically switch between the A and the B task a lot faster than the children and the adults can, or the older adults. Next, looking at the near transfer, we're investigating the reduction of switching and mixing costs from pre-test to post-test. So another 4-way ANOVA was conducted. And we can see that there's a main effect of reaction time at post-test compared to pre-test. And also that mixing costs were larger for older adults and children, but there were no significant differences in switching costs or age differences, as we can see with the very insignificant p-value. But however, both types of costs were reduced pre-test to post-test. They just weren't all significant for age differences. And near transfer was not modulated by verbal self-instructions. So when participants had to verbalize the upcoming rule, that didn't improve performance. So we see another insignificant p-value. And then mixing costs were reduced when training tasks were variable. So the variability in the tasks and stimuli did improve performance. So these are the graphs that show the same results that I was just talking about. So they're divided between the 3 age groups. On the left, we see the mixing costs. On the right, we see the switching costs. And from here, we can see that from pre-test and post-test, there's always an improvement by post-test in all of the conditions. However, the differences are smallest in the single task ones, rather than all the ones that involve task switching. And also the younger adults, the mixing costs and switching costs are right from the beginning are a lot smaller. So the differences in mixing costs, switching costs are smaller because they started so much better. This just also shows the effect sizes. So all the results for near transfer were found and supported by the effect sizes. So the large effect sizes after task switching training, than the single task training, and children showed the most improvement in mixing costs after task switch training and in switching costs when it included the variability as well. And then now looking at the FAR transfer. So first looking at the Stroop task because it was measured differently than the rest of the 3 executive functioning tasks because it looked at reaction time rather than the percentage of correct responses. There was a main effect or an interaction effect of session, training, and trial type. And this indicates that interference was reduced from pre-test to post-test after the task switching training, but not after the single task training. So we can see, again, an insignificant p-value. So these, just continuing with the statistics, this graph shows us the mean responses pre-test and post-test. So we can see the 3 age groups here, and then we can also see the single task in training and then the task switching training. So with these 3 down here, we can see the same pattern of responses in all the groups for pre-test, single task training to post-test of the same single task training. Responses are always about the same, maybe a little bit of improvement, but not much. And then the task switching training, we can see very large improvements post-test. So from here to here, 71.6 to 81.3, much more significant improvements. What's interesting is the Stroop interference though. So for the task switching, we can see the same pattern we've been seeing, an improvement in performance. So a longer response time pre-test, much faster post-test for all of the groups. However, for the single task training in children, it was roughly the same, but in young adults and older adults, the reaction time actually got longer post-test, which was an interesting finding. Then lastly, looking at FAR test or FAR transfer, so the rest of the cognitive tasks, this time using a 2-way ANOVA, using age and training. The results showed that task switching training groups showed more FAR transfer than single task groups for all 3 of the different tasks, so verbal, spatial working memory, and fluid intelligence. And then these just show the effect sizes. So we can see the mixed costs, switching costs, incongruent to control verbal and spatial working memory, and fluid intelligence. And the biggest takeaway from this is we can see that the task switching training, so the straight lines without the dots, the effect sizes are always above 0. So they're showing an effect versus the single task training. Sometimes it's at 0, sometimes it's even negative or just above 0 for the age groups. So a lot less of an effect is seen for this. Okay, now moving on to the discussion. So there's a lot of findings from the study. So this is just a summary of them. So first we saw evidence of transfer of task switching training to a structurally similar new task after training, which was expected. Near transfer on the level of mix and costs was most pronounced in children and older adults, which was also expected because younger adults were already better pre-test. The type of training modulated the amount of transfer, so all the different trainings had different effects on post-test performance. And then in contrast to single task switching training resulted in improved performance in all 4 of the tasks in the cognitive battery. So theoretical implications related to the hypotheses of the study. So the first hypothesis was correct, and it is likely related to the constructivist learning theory, because we have this schema built from the beginning, and then with training, we're adding to it. So that's why performance is improving. The second hypothesis was also correct. We expected more transfer of training to structurally similar tasks than to structurally dissimilar tasks. My hypothesis, the first one, was correct, and it seems to align with the prefrontal cortex development because the differences in post-test to pre-test performance was smallest in young adults because they have the most developed prefrontal cortexes or nearly developed, while young children is still developing. In older adults, we're seeing cognitive decay and decay of the brain, which I'll touch on more later. And then my second hypothesis was only partially correct. It was that young children will show better performance after training in comparison to the older adult group. This was only true when variability was used. Otherwise, there were no significant differences in the training types and performance. So this relates to the prefrontal cortex that I mentioned. So with the Adele Diamond reading that we touched on in class, we can see 3 to 7-year-olds are starting to develop their prefrontal cortexes and are improving in cognitive tasks. So like the day and night task, we're seeing improvements. And then as they get older, so 7 and onwards, we're seeing improvements in more complex cognitive tasks because the prefrontal cortex is developing more, so improvement in the Stroop task. And then continuing on from this, looking at older adulthood, this study by Morcom and Henson kind of highlighted prefrontal cortex development along the lifespan and focusing on the young adult to older adult. They're showing a decrease in function because that part of the brain is decaying. So older adults need a much higher level of prefrontal cortex activity to perform to the same level as younger adults. And then practical implications. So we're seeing we can use variability in tasks and stimuli while teaching children because children seem to show pretty significant effects in performance when there is variability in training. So in the study, they also included the transportation task and a color task to improve performance. And other studies have kind of taken this and applied it to classroom settings. So this study found that variability in constant learning resulted in more correct and faster word learning. So it's already started to be applied to the classrooms. So seeing more of this and applying it in different ways can help learning. And then a second implication is clinical application in ADHD treatment. So children with ADHD typically struggle in a subset of executive functioning tasks, for example, inhibition. So rather than repeatedly practicing tasks that work on inhibition, it might also be beneficial to practice other executive functioning tasks, and it might also improve inhibition in that way. So we're seeing FAR transfer. One study kind of touched on this a little bit. They found that children with ADHD who participated in 12 weeks of executive functioning training in a whole wide range of tasks improved performance in all the executive functioning areas and tasks, including ones that weren't even practiced. And some limitations from the study. So it was kind of small sample sizes. There was 56 individuals in each age group, but once each age group was divided into the 4 types of training, that's only 14 individuals in each group. So that's not a very large sample. So we might see some effects that weren't seen if we had more individuals, or it would stay the same. We don't really know. And then the assumption that all of the cognitive processes were trained, we don't know that for sure. It might have been more beneficial for some individuals than others. And it's not very generalizable. As I mentioned in the beginning, the sample was taken from individuals in Germany, so it doesn't apply to children who learn in other areas. So this study here, they found cultural differences in US-born and China-born children in learning style due to cultural differences. So if the sample was more diverse, we might see different results. And then there wasn't a lot of variation in the cognitive battery, specifically the verbal and spatial working memory tasks. Tasks were pretty similar in how they were formatted. So if they were more different, we might see different effects in FAR transfer. And then suggestions for future research. This study really focused on the short-term effects because it was a maximum of 8 weeks. But if testing was done after 6 months or a year, it would be interesting to see how the effects carry over. And then another suggestion would be to perform a similar study just in children, but focus on the individual differences in performance. So focusing on each child, seeing how they learn best, seeing their transfer distance, and then applying this in individualized learning plans. So a study here highlight the importance of individualized learning plans in children's academic success. So this can be utilized in forming these individualized plans to improve performance in school. And the study doesn't really explore how older adults learn best, and there does seem to be a lack of research in general in this area. So it'd be cool to see these type of studies with a more focus on older adults to figure out how they learn best. So in conclusion, we saw age-related differences in mixing costs and near and far transfer of training, not as much in switching costs. And single task training was not effective in reducing costs. All of the training groups that included the switching showed improvements. There's a lot of areas that this study could be carried over and we could learn a lot more. So that is all. Thank you.